In the year 536 AD, a major global event saw the world plunged into darkness and despair. Temperatures plummeted, crops failed, people starved, and the colder climate became the perfect breeding ground for disease. Modern scholars have called 536 not just a terrible year in human history, but perhaps the worst year ever to be alive. It began the coldest decade in 2,500 years, and its effects were still felt over a century later. Prior to the year 536, life for the average citizen in Europe, the Middle East, or Asia was already a struggle. Toiling in the fields day and night, they had to contend with almost constant warfare and disease rampaging through their villages. Any chance of comfort was impossible, with the bulk of their crop going to a lord or king in tax to avoid brutal punishment or being forced into slavery. But when the people woke up to a weak, cold sun in 536, initially bluish in color, they must have feared the worst. We know today this was due to the dust in the atmosphere reflecting other colors away, likely shot into the atmosphere following a volcanic eruption. But, not understanding any of this, the terrified people looking at the sky must have considered it an ominous and foreboding sign. The sun was light but not bright, and if the obscured sky was not enough, across the Eurasian landmass a thick fog hung in the air. At the height of noon, with the sun not getting any brighter or warmer, people would have looked down at the ground and been astonished by their lack of a shadow. This may seem an obvious and trivial point to us today, but for historians and record-keepers of the 6th century, this was shocking enough for several of them to report. Almost immediately, the air would have felt noticeably cooler. The drastic drop in temperatures was enough to affect the delicate balance of agriculture, and the speed with which it arrived gave the people little time to prepare. As the year continued into autumn, and the seasons blended into one, harvests all over the world began to fail. The Greek scholar Procopius remarked that this year a most dread portent took place, and men were free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death. China experienced snowfall in August, delaying their harvest, while elsewhere unseasonable frosts made apples harden, grapes sour, bread production fail, and other crops die in the fields. Food reserves were used up, and soon after, people began to starve. Some of the larger empires, such as the Byzantines, reported attempts to relieve famine in their borders, although how successful these were, we do not know. Given the size of Byzantine, reaching all of its citizens must have been an impossible task. For others, living in smaller tribes or nations, there was no help to come. Many of those who didn't starve packed up their lives and migrated, not knowing if better conditions awaited or if the local inhabitants would even be friendly. Arable land was left abandoned with no one there to work it, and the European economy began to collapse. It was medieval scholar Michael McCormick who first called 536 the worst year to be alive. But as it came to an end, life didn't get much easier. For the average person still alive, when the fog had dissipated and the sky had cleared, they had to contend with severe malnutrition and migrating nomads looking for better land. Temperatures and weather still remained erratic, crops still failed, and towns filled with weak, starving people and their compromised immune systems proved the perfect breeding ground for disease. Likely emerging from North China and arriving in Europe through Western trade routes around 541, the plague of Justinian swept across the Eurasian continent. Named after the Byzantine emperor of the time, as many as 50 million people died worldwide, around half the world's population. A major contributing factor in the spread of the plague was the migration across the continent of many ethnic groups, all seeking better land after the struggles of 536. The Lombards moved from Central Europe into Italy. The early Slavs migrated to the Balkans. Mongols moved south into China proper, and other nomadic Asian tribes poured into the west. The arriving migrants often clashed with the locals, leading to war, bloodshed, and further pressures on the strained empires of the 6th century. In Peru, the Maoche people experienced 30 years of rainfall and floods, followed by 30 years of drought in the years immediately following 536. Having existed since the 2nd century, their civilization faded away shortly after. In India, the Gupta Empire was similarly ravaged by floods caused by the change in weather, bringing it to an end after 200 years. There were also accounts of great mortality in Britain and Ireland, with many historians linking the famines of 536 to the death of the legendary King Arthur. The Irish annals, meanwhile, simply recorded a failure of bread from 536 to 539, showing the long and slow road to recovery. For many, the ramifications of having to deal with millions dead and a severe lack of food would drag on for over a century. But for at least one nation, the fall in temperatures actually turned out to be a blessing. The Arabian world saw the fertility in their soil increase, and as early Islam thrived, they took advantage of the weakened Byzantine and Sassanid empires, conquering much of the Middle East and beginning their rise to prominence on the continent. While some have postulated the cause to be a falling comet or meteorite, the lack of an impact crater has led many to believe a volcanic eruption was more likely. Evidence of sulfate deposits in ice matches the levels usually found following an eruption. Sulfur and other substances spewed into the atmosphere can form a veil, reflecting the sun's light back into space and cooling the planet below. This theory is corroborated with tree ring records showing stunted growth around that time, likely due to a reduction in sunlight. Scientists have speculated where this eruption could have occurred, with suggestions ranging from Krakatoa, Papua New Guinea, El Salvador, and North America. The latest theory from 2018 suggests Iceland is the most likely candidate, but more work is needed to pin this down for sure. To make matters more complicated, and no doubt extend the suffering all over the world, two subsequent volcanic eruptions are known to have happened. One in 540 and another in 547. Although the locations of these are not known, they compounded the effects of that in 536, heralding the period known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which lasted until 660. Europe was 2.5 degrees Celsius colder on average, and while that may not sound like a lot, when we compare it to modern-day concerns of climate change, in which global temperatures have increased by only half of that in a century, the severity and quickness of the drop become clear. Those same ice deposits that point to a cataclysmic event in the 6th century also show the signs of civilization's later resurgence. By 640, there is evidence of silver mining, signaling that economies had begun to pick up, and the world was finally ready to move forward. Maybe someday, scientists can unearth the exact location of the supposed eruption that caused so much devastation worldwide, but while the exact cause remains a source of speculation, the real evidence of its effects are found in the accounts of those who experienced it. The Byzantine historian Procopius, various Roman statesmen and Christian clergymen, and the official record-keeping of failed harvests and mounting deaths all give us the smallest idea of how awful life must have been. We have no way of knowing the full extent of the human suffering and despair people must have experienced in 536 and the years that followed, but simply imagining it is enough. While not every year is as bad as 536, they all have their own story to tell. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to never miss another.